The Vecturi had ruled the stars for 3,000 years. They were tall creatures, almost 8 feet high, with skin like dark stone and eyes that glowed like dying embers. Their ships blocked out suns. Their armies had crushed 100 worlds. And they had done it all through one simple method: fear. When a species refused to bow, the Vecturi did not negotiate. They did not threaten. They simply burned that species from existence. They destroyed every city, every village, every record that proved those people had ever lived. Then they moved to the next world and asked again, "Will you kneel?" Most species knelt. Humanity was no different. When the first Vecturi warships appeared above Earth, the governments of the world had 2 choices: fight and die, or submit and survive. They chose survival. It was not a proud choice, but it kept the human race alive. That was 40 years ago. Now, human colonies scattered across the frontier served as tribute worlds for the Dominion. They mined ore. They built parts for Vecturi machines. They worked until their bodies broke, and then they worked some more. This was the price of survival. On a small mining colony called New Carthage, life under Vecturi rule had become normal. The people there had never known anything else. Children grew up learning that the tall stone-skinned masters were to be obeyed without question. They learned that looking a Vecturi in the eye meant death. They learned that hope was a dangerous thing. The colony sat in a valley between 2 dead mountains. The air smelled of sulfur and metal. Great machines dug into the earth day and night, pulling out the rare minerals that the Dominion needed for their weapons. Humans operated these machines. Humans died in these mines. And Vecturi soldiers watched from their towers, waiting for any sign of disobedience. Overlord Varechthos commanded New Carthage. He was old by Vecturi standards, over 600 years, and he had spent most of that time breaking lesser species. He believed that fear was the only language that mattered. Love, hope, kindness, these were weaknesses. Only fear was real. Only fear lasted. He walked through the colony once a week, surrounded by his guards. The humans would stop whatever they were doing and press themselves against the walls. They would lower their eyes. They would hold their breath until he passed. This pleased Varechthos. This was how things should be. But lately, something had changed. The humans still obeyed. They still lowered their eyes. But Varechthos could sense something beneath the surface. The mining quotas were not being met. Workers moved slowly, as if their bodies were tired, but their minds were somewhere else. And sometimes, when he looked at them, he saw something in their faces that he could not name. It was not defiance. Not exactly. It was more like patience. This bothered him. Among the workers was a man named Thomas Marin. Before the occupation, he had been a military engineer. He had designed weapons, built defense systems, solved problems that others said could not be solved. Now he spent his days in the mines, breathing poison air and breaking rocks. Thomas was 43 years old, but he looked 60. The work had aged him. The grief had aged him more. He had watched friends die in the mines. He had buried his own brother after a cave collapse. He had learned to keep his head down and his mouth shut, but he had not forgotten who he was. Thomas lived in a small housing unit near the eastern edge of the colony. He shared it with his wife Elena and their 7-year-old daughter Lily. The unit had 2 rooms, no windows, and walls so thin you could hear your neighbors breathing. It was not much, but it was home. Elena had been a teacher before the occupation. Now she worked in the processing plant, sorting ore with her bare hands until they bled. She never complained. She told Thomas that complaining was a waste of energy. Better to save that energy for surviving another day. Lily was the light in their darkness. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's stubborn chin. She asked questions constantly. Why is the sky gray? Why did the masters have glowing eyes? Why can't we leave? Thomas and Elena answered as best they could. Some questions had no good answers. At night, when Lily was asleep, Thomas and Elena would sit together and talk in whispers. They talked about the old days before the victory came. They talked about blue skies and green forests and oceans that stretched beyond sight. They talked about freedom. These conversations were dangerous. The victory had listening devices everywhere. But Thomas and Elena were careful. They used old codes, phrases that sounded innocent but carried hidden meanings. They had learned these codes from others in the colony, who had learned them from others still. There was a network. It spread across a dozen colony worlds, connecting humans who had not given up. They did not call it a resistance. That word was too dangerous. They simply called it the family. Thomas was part of the family. So was Elena. So were hundreds of others on New Carthage, and thousands more on other worlds. They shared information. They passed along skills. They waited. For what? Thomas was not sure. The victory were too strong. Humanity had no ships, no weapons, no way to fight back. Any uprising would be crushed in hours. The smart thing to do was accept reality and try to make life as bearable as possible. But Thomas could not accept it. Every time he looked at Lily, he thought about the future she would have. A life of slavery. A life of fear. A life where she would grow old serving creatures who saw her as less than an animal. No, he could not accept that. So he waited. He watched. He learned. And deep inside, in a place he shared with no one except Elena, he held on to something that the victory had tried to destroy. Hope. It was a small thing, barely a spark. But sparks could become fires. And fires could burn down empires. Thomas did not know when the moment would come. He did not know what would finally push humanity over the edge. But he believed, with every fiber of his being, that the moment would come. He just had to be ready. In the housing unit next door, a baby cried. Outside, a victory patrol marched past, their heavy boots shaking the ground. In the distance, the mining machines groaned and screamed as they tore into the earth. Life on New Carthage continued. The humans worked. The victory watched. And beneath the surface, invisible to the masters who thought they controlled everything, something was growing. Something patient. Something hangry. Something human. The day that changed everything began like any other day on New Carthage. The morning sirens screamed at 5 o'clock, dragging the workers from their beds. Thomas kissed Lily on the forehead while she was still half asleep. Elena braided her daughter's hair quickly, her fingers moving from memory. They had done this 1,000 times before. Be good today, Elena whispered to Lily. Stay close to Mrs. Chun. Don't wander off. Lily nodded, rubbing her eyes. I know, Mama. I'm always good. Thomas smiled at that. She was always good. Too good for this place. Too bright for this gray world. He and Elena left for their work shifts. Lily went to the community building where the colony's children spent their days. An old woman named Mrs. Chun watched over them, teaching them basic reading and math when the victory weren't looking. It wasn't much of a childhood, but it was all they had. By midday, the colony was buzzing with nervous energy. Word had spread that Overlord Varechthos was coming for one of his inspections. These inspections were always dangerous. The Overlord looked for any excuse to make an example of someone. Last month, he had executed a man for coughing in his presence. The workers were pulled from the mines and the processing plants. They were made to stand in the central square, arranged in neat rows. The victory guards walked between them, looking for anything out of place. A dirty uniform. A disrespectful expression. A sign of weakness. Thomas stood in the third row, his heart pounding. Elena was somewhere behind him. He could not turn to look for her. Looking around was forbidden. The children were brought out too. This was unusual. Normally, the children were kept away during inspections. But today, Varechthos wanted everyone present. He wanted the whole colony to see what happened when production quotas were not met. Thomas spotted Lily in the crowd of children. She looked scared. Of course, she was scared. She was 7 years old, and an 8-foot monster was about to walk among them like a god of death. The Overlord arrived. He came with 20 guards, all of them armed with plasma rifles. His ceremonial armor gleamed black in the gray light. His eyes burned like coals. He moved slowly, deliberately, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. "Your output has fallen," Varechthos said. His voice was deep and cold, like stones grinding together. "For 3 months, this colony has failed to meet its quota. I have been patient. I have been merciful. But my patience has limits." He walked through the crowd, and the humans parted before him like water. No one breathed. No one moved. "I think you have forgotten your place," the Overlord continued. "I think you have forgotten what happens to species that disappoint the Dominion. Allow me to remind you. It happened so fast that the group of children was near the edge of the square. When the guards moved, some of the children got separated from Mrs. Chun. They were pushed and jostled by the crowd. One of them stumbled forward, away from the others. It was Lily. She felt her hands and knees right in the path of the Overlord's procession. She looked up, her eyes wide with terror, and found herself staring directly at Varechthos. For one heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the Overlord drew a ceremonial blade. Thomas saw it happen. He saw his daughter on the ground. He saw the weapon rise. He screamed her name and tried to push through the crowd, but there were too many people, too many bodies in his way. The blade came down. Lily did not make a sound. She simply crumpled, like a puppet with its strings cut. A pool of red spread beneath her small body. The Overlord stepped over her like she was nothing, like she was garbage in his path. "Let this be a lesson," he said. "There are no accidents. There is no mercy. There is only obedience or death." Thomas reached his daughter. He fell to his knees and gathered her broken body in his arms. She was still warm. Her eyes were still open, but there was nothing behind them anymore. The light that had made her Lily was gone. Elena's screaming cut through the silence. It was a sound that Thomas would hear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. She pushed through the crowd and collapsed beside him, her hands reaching for their daughter, her voice breaking into sounds that were no longer words. The Overlord watched them. He expected them to beg. He expected them to grovel. This was what always happened. The lesser species would cry and plead, and then they would obey even harder than before. Fear was a beautiful tool, but something was wrong. The humans in the crowd were not cowering. They were not looking away. They were staring at the Overlord with expressions he had never seen before on human faces. It was not fear, it was not grief, it was something older. Something that the Vectory had thought they had burned out of every conquered species. Long ago, it was rage, cold, silent, patient rage. Varechthos felt something strange in that moment. A flicker of uncertainty. He pushed it away. These were humans. Weak, soft humans. They could feel whatever they wanted. They could do nothing. He turned and walked away, his guards falling in behind him. The inspection was over. The lesson had been taught. Everything would return to normal. He was wrong. That night, Thomas sat alone in his housing unit. Elena had been sedated by a neighbor who had medical training. She was sleeping now, but her face was still twisted with pain even in sleep. Thomas did not cry. He had moved beyond crying. He had moved beyond grief. He had arrived at a place inside himself that he had not known existed. He thought about his daughter, her laugh, her questions. The way she would climb into his lap and demand stories about the old Earth, the one with blue skies and green forests. He thought about the Overlord, the casual cruelty, the blade falling, the way Verechthos had stepped over her body like it meant nothing, and he made a decision. No more waiting, no more patience, no more hope that someday things would get better on their own. The Vectri had ruled through fear for 3,000 years. They had broken 100 species. They thought they knew everything there was to know about terror. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Thomas reached under his bed and pulled out a small communication device. It was Forbidden's technology, built in secret, hidden for years. He had never used it before. He had been waiting for the right moment. This was the moment. He activated the device and sent a message through channels that stretched across a dozen colony worlds. The message was short. It contained 3 words and an image. The image was Lily's face. The 3 words were simple. Remember, prepare, soon. Within hours, the message had reached millions of humans. Workers in mines, engineers in factories, veterans who remembered how to fight, parents who looked at their own children and felt their blood turn to ice. The Vectri did not notice. They were too busy celebrating another successful display of dominance. They had no idea what they had just awakened. The message spread like fire through dry grass, on mining worlds and factory planets, in orbital stations and underground shelters. Humans received the image of a dead child in 3 simple words. They did not need explanations. They did not need speeches. They looked at Lilymarin's face, and they understood. The time for waiting was over. The Vectri intelligence networks picked up fragments of the communications. Analysts studied the data and wrote reports. The reports said the same thing they always said. The humans were upset, but they would calm down. They had no weapons. They had no ships. They had no way to fight. This was just noise. Grief-fueled noise that would fade in a few weeks. The analysts were very, very wrong. For 40 years, humanity had been preparing. Not openly, not loudly, but with a patience that the Vectri could not imagine. The conquerors thought they had taken everything from the humans. They had taken their ships, their weapons, their freedom. But they had not taken their minds. Engineers had designed weapons in their heads and built them in hidden workshops. They used spare parts and stolen materials. They worked at night, in secret, piece by piece. The weapons were crude compared to Vectri technology, but they worked. Pilots had trained on simulators disguised as mining equipment. They had never flown real ships, but they knew every system, every control, every trick. They were ready. Soldiers had passed down their knowledge to the next generation. Old veterans who had fought in Earth's last wars before the occupation taught young people how to shoot, how to move, how to fight in ways that no manual could describe. They trained in basements and abandoned tunnels, using wooden sticks instead of rifles. But the skills were real. And then there were the ships. The Vectri thought they had destroyed all of humanity's vessels. They were wrong. Some ships had been hidden in asteroid fields, their signals dark, their crews waiting. Others had been reported as scrapped but were actually stripped down, hidden in pieces, ready to be rebuilt when the time came. The time had come. On New Carthage, Thomas Marin became the center of the storm. He did not want to lead. He did not care about glory or power. He only wanted one thing: to make the Vectri pay for what they had done. But the resistance needed a face. They needed someone who could turn grief into action, who could make people believe that the impossible was possible. Thomas was that person. Not because he was special, but because his pain was everyone's pain. Every human who saw him thought of their own children, their own families, their own fear. Within weeks, the scattered cells of the resistance began to connect. Messages flew between worlds. Plans were made. Resources were shared. The network that had been sleeping for decades woke up all at once. Thomas met with the other leaders through encrypted channels. There was General Sarah Cole, a woman in her 70s who had commanded Earth's defense forces during the first invasion. There was Marcus Webb, a young engineer who had designed weapons that could penetrate vectory armor. There was Dr. Amara Okonkwo, a scientist who had found weaknesses in the enemy's technology that no one else had noticed. Together, they built a plan, but humanity could not win alone. The vectory dominion was too large, too powerful. They needed allies. This was the most dangerous part of the plan. The other species under vectory rule had been broken even more thoroughly than the humans. They had been slaves for centuries. Most of them had forgotten what freedom even meant, but some remembered. The Kovali were a reptilian species from a hot desert world. They had been conquered 500 years ago. Their warriors had once been feared across the galaxy. Now they worked as laborers, their claws dulled, their spirits crushed. But deep in their collective memory, they still carried the fire of their ancestors. Thomas sent a message to the Kovali elders. He told them about Lily. He told them about the uprising. He asked them one simple question: do you want to die as slaves or live as free people? The elders debated for 3 days. Then they sent their answer: we will fight. The Thesan were next. They were a species of scholars and scientists, their bodies thin and frail, but their minds sharp as knives. The Vecturi used them as technicians and researchers, taking advantage of their intelligence while treating them like property. The Thesan had no love for violence, but they had even less love for the Dominion. When Thomas reached out to them, they offered something more valuable than soldiers. They offered information. Maps of Vecturi installations, codes for their communication networks, weaknesses in their ships and weapons. One by one, the subjugated species joined the alliance. Not all of them, and not easily. Some were too afraid. Some did not trust the humans. Some believed that resistance was suicide, but enough of them said yes. The Vecturi noticed nothing. They were too arrogant. They had ruled for 3,000 years, and in all that time, no conquered species had ever successfully rebelled. They believed it was impossible. They believed that fear was absolute. They were about to learn that fear has limits. As the months passed, strange things began to happen across the Dominion. Supply ships disappeared. Garrison outposts went silent. Officers vanished without a trace. The Vecturi investigated each incident, but they found no pattern, no connection. Just accidents, they told themselves. Just coincidences. Thomas watched the reports and smiled grimly. The attacks were not random. They were tests. The resistance was probing the enemy's defenses, learning their response times, finding the gaps in their armor. On New Carthage, life continued as before. The humans worked. The Vecturi watched. Overlord Varechthos walked through the colony and saw nothing but obedient slaves. But Thomas was different now. He no longer hid his eyes. He looked at the Overlord directly, and Varechthos saw something in that gaze that made him uncomfortable. It was not defiance, exactly. It was patience. The patience of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The Overlord told himself it meant nothing. Humans were prey. They had always been prey. They would always be prey. 1 year after Lily's death, Thomas stood in a hidden chamber beneath the mines. Around him were 100 fighters, human and alien alike. They wore mismatched armor. They carried weapons built from scraps and stolen parts. They were not an army. Not yet, but they were ready. Thomas looked at their faces. He saw fear there, but also hope. Hope that had been buried for generations, now rising to the surface like a seed pushing through concrete. They think we are nothing, he said, his voice quiet but steady. They think we are insects beneath their boots. They killed my daughter because she stumbled, because she was in the wrong place at the wrong time, because to them, we are less than animals." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Tomorrow, we show them how wrong they are. Tomorrow, we stop being prey. Tomorrow, we become the thing they never thought possible." He raised his fist. "Tomorrow, we become their nightmare." 100 voices answered him. Human voices. Kovali voices. Decent voices. All of them united by something stronger than fear. Something stronger than hate. Something that the Vectri had never understood and never would. The will to be free. The uprising began at midnight on the anniversary of Lily Marin's death. Across a dozen worlds, humans and their allies struck at the same moment. They hit communication towers, power stations, and weapons depots. They attacked with speed and precision, vanishing before the Vectri could respond. But the first real blow came on New Carthage. Thomas Marin led a team of 50 fighters through tunnels that the Vectri did not know existed. They had dug these tunnels over years, handful by handful, hiding the dirt in their clothes and dumping it in the mines. The work had been slow and painful, but it had given them a path directly into the Overlord's compound. Vorexthos was sleeping when the alarms began to scream. He woke to the sound of explosions and plasma fire. His guards rushed into his chamber, shouting reports that made no sense. Humans inside the compound. Humans with weapons. Humans fighting like they had never fought before. Impossible, Vorexthos thought. This is impossible. He grabbed his ceremonial blade and ran toward the command center. If he could reach his communications array, he could call for reinforcements. The nearest Dominion fleet would arrive in hours. All he had to do was survive until then. He did not survive. Thomas found him in the corridor outside the command center. The Overlord was surrounded by 6 guards, but the guards were already dying. Human fighters poured out of the shadows, their weapons crude but effective. The Vectri soldiers fell one by one. Then it was just Vorexthos and Thomas standing face to face. The Overlord was larger, stronger, better armed. He had 600 years of combat experience. He had killed thousands of enemies with his own hands. But Thomas had something the Overlord did not have. Nothing left to lose. The fight was short and brutal. Vorexthos swung his blade, but Thomas dodged and drove a knife into the gap between the Overlord's armor plates. The Vectri roared and threw Thomas against the wall. Thomas got up and attacked again, and again, and again. He fought like a man who did not care if he died. He fought like a man who was already dead inside and had only one purpose left: revenge. When it was over, Vorexthos lay on the ground, his glowing eyes flickering and fading. Thomas stood over him, bleeding from a dozen wounds but still standing. "Do you remember her?" Thomas asked. "The child you killed. Do you even remember her face?" The Overlord did not answer. His eyes went dark. Thomas activated the compound's broadcast system. His face appeared on every screen across the Dominion, from the smallest outpost to the throne world itself. Millions of Vectri saw a human standing over their dead Overlord, covered in blood. "You taught us fear," Thomas said into the camera. "Now we will teach you what fear really means." The message ended. The war began. What followed was not a battle. It was not even a war in the traditional sense. It was something the Vectri had never experienced before. Total, relentless, unstoppable fury. Human tactics were nothing like what the Dominion expected. The Vectri military was designed to crush enemies through overwhelming force. They would gather their fleets, advance in formation, and destroy anything in their path. It was simple and effective. It had worked for 3,000 years, but humans did not fight that way. They attacked from nowhere. They struck at weak points and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. They used the environment itself as a weapon, collapsing tunnels, poisoning water supplies, turning the Vectory's own technology against them. They also used fear. For centuries, the Dominion had been the source of all terror. They were the monsters in the dark. But now, humans became the monsters. They left messages on destroyed ships. They let survivors go so they could spread stories. They made the Vectory afraid to sleep, afraid to travel, afraid to be alone. The psychological effect was devastating. Vectory soldiers began to hesitate. Officers made mistakes. Entire garrisons surrendered without fighting because they had heard what happened to those who resisted. The other species watched in amazement. The Kovali Elder, who had dismissed humans as soft mammals, saw them charge through plasma fire to rescue prisoners. The Thesan war scholars recorded human soldiers laughing as they stormed fortified positions. A Vectory admiral, watching his fleet burn, said to his crew, "They are not fighting to win. They are fighting like they want to die. How do you defeat an enemy who does not fear death?" He had no answer. None of them did. The war spread across the galaxy. Colony after colony fell to the rebellion. Ships that had been hidden for decades emerged from asteroid fields, crewed by pilots who had trained their whole lives for this moment. Weapons factories that the Vectory thought they controlled began producing guns for the Resistance instead. And the Alliance held. Humans, Kovali, Thesan, and a dozen other species fought side by side. They had different bodies, different cultures, different histories. But they all shared the same enemy and the same dream. Freedom. The Vectory High Council met in emergency session on their throne world. They had never faced a crisis like this. For 3,000 years, they had been invincible. Now their empire was burning. Some counselors argued for total war. They wanted to deploy planet killers to burn every rebellious world to ash, to exterminate the humans entirely. Others warned that this would only make things worse. The rebellion was spreading too fast. If they destroyed one world, 10 more would rise up. In the end, they decided to negotiate. They would offer the humans some small freedoms, some minor improvements in their conditions. They would let them think they had won something. Then, in a few generations, when the rebellion was forgotten, they would crush them again. It was a good plan. It might have worked, but the humans were not interested in negotiation. "They want to talk," General Sarah Cole said when the offer arrived. "They want to make a deal." Thomas read the message. He thought about Lily. He thought about all the children who had died under Vectory rule. He thought about 3,000 years of slavery and death and fear. "No deals," he said. "No compromises. We end this, all of it." The war continued. By the 15th month, the Dominion had lost half its territory. Their fleets were scattered and broken. Their supply lines were cut. Their soldiers were deserting. By the 17th month, human ships were entering Vectory space for the first time in history. They were not invaders. They were liberators. Species that had been enslaved for centuries greeted them with tears and cheers. By the 18th month, the rebellion stood at the gates of Vector Prime itself. The last battle was coming. The Dominion had gathered everything it had left for a final stand. Thousands of ships, millions of soldiers, weapons that could crack planets open like eggs. Against them was an alliance of freed slaves, armed with stolen technology and homemade weapons. It should have been no contest, but the Vectory had already lost. They just did not know it yet. Thomas Marin stood on the bridge of the flagship Lily's Vengeance. It was a captured Vectory battlecruiser, renamed and refitted, now crewed by humans and their allies. Through the viewport, he could see Vector Prime, the throne world, the heart of the Empire, the place where, 3,000 years ago, the Dominion had begun its reign of terror. Soon, it would be over. "All ships report ready," said the communications officer. Thomas nodded. He touched the small pendant around his neck. It contained a photograph of Lily, the only image he had left. For her, he whispered. For all of them. Then he gave the order to attack. The sky above Vector Prime burned with the light of 1,000 ships. Human vessels, Kovali cruisers, Thesan frigates, and ships from a dozen other species formed a massive fleet that stretched across the stars. Against them stood the last remnants of the Vectori Grand Armada, the final defenders of an empire that had ruled through terror for 3,000 years. The battle lasted 6 hours. It was the largest space battle in recorded history. Ships exploded like tiny suns. Debris fields stretched for thousands of miles. Millions died on both sides. But in the end, there was no doubt about the outcome. The Vectori fought with desperation, but desperation was not enough. The Alliance fought with something stronger: purpose. Every pilot, every gunner, every soldier knew exactly why they were there. They were fighting for freedom. They were fighting for their children. They were fighting for a future where no species would ever bow to another. When the last Vectori battleship fell, a silence spread across the fleet. Then, slowly, the cheering began. Humans hugged Kovali. Thesan scientists wept openly. Species that had been enemies for generations embraced like family. Thomas Marin did not cheer. He stood alone on the bridge of the Lily's Vengeance, looking down at the throne world. Vector Prime was beautiful. It had blue oceans and green continents and cities that shone like jewels in the sunlight. Billions of Vectori lived there, most of them civilians who had never harmed anyone. General Sarah Cole approached him. She was old and tired, but her eyes were sharp as ever. "We've won," she said. "The Dominion is finished. Their military is destroyed. Their colonies are surrendering. It's over." Thomas nodded slowly. "Almost over." Cole understood what he meant. She had seen the reports. Some of the Alliance leaders wanted to bomb Vector Prime into collapse. They wanted to give the Vectori the same fate they had given so many others. They called it justice. They called it balance. "The fleet is waiting for your order," Cole said. "They'll do whatever you say. If you want to destroy the planet, they'll destroy it. You've earned that right." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. He thought about Lily. He thought about holding her body in his arms while her blood soaked into his clothes. He thought about the hatred that had kept him alive for 18 months of war. He had every reason to give the order. The Vectori deserved it. They had murdered and enslaved billions. They had burned entire civilizations from existence. They had killed his daughter for the crime of stumbling in front of their overlord. One word, and they would feel the same terror they had inflicted on others. One word. "No," Thomas said. Cole raised an eyebrow. "No, we are not them." Thomas turned away from the viewport and faced the general. "We were never them. That's why we won." He walked to the communication console and opened the channel to the entire fleet. "This is Thomas Marin. The war is over. The Vectori Dominion has fallen. But I want to make something clear to all of you. We did not fight this war to become monsters. We fought it to end monstrous rule." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "We will not bomb Vector Prime. We will not exterminate their people. We will do what they never did for us. We will show mercy, not because they deserve it, but because we deserve to be better than them. Because our children deserve to grow up in a galaxy where might does not make right. Because the only way to truly end their empire is to build something they never could. A peace based on justice, not fear." The fleet was silent. Thomas could feel the tension through the communication channel. Many of them wanted revenge. Many of them had lost family to the Vectori. Asking them to show mercy was asking the impossible. But slowly, one by one, voices began to respond. "Understood, sir. Copy that. We're with you." Not everyone agreed. Some ships went silent. Some pilots cursed and logged off. But most of them The majority of them accepted the order. They chose to be human. The occupation of Vector Prime was unlike anything in history. Human soldiers landed on the throne world, not as conquerors, but as liberators. They secured the government buildings without massacring the officials inside. They established order without terror. The Vectori could not understand it. They had spent 3,000 years believing that power meant cruelty, that strength meant domination. The idea that their conquerors would treat them with fairness was impossible to process. Some Vectori resisted. They were captured and tried for their crimes. Those who had committed atrocities were punished. Those who had simply been soldiers or citizens were released. It was not perfect. There were incidents of revenge killings, moments when the rage boiled over. But the leadership held firm, and slowly, painfully, a new order began to emerge. The Vectori Dominion was dissolved. In its place rose the Galactic Alliance, a union of all species based on equality and mutual respect. There were no masters and slaves. There were only partners. Thomas Marin was offered the role of Alliance Chancellor. He refused. "I'm not a leader," he said. "I'm just a man who lost his daughter. Find someone who wants to build." I only knew how to tear down. He returned to New Carthage. The colony was different now. The mining machines were silent. The guard towers were empty. Humans walked in the sunlight without fear, their heads held high. A memorial had been built in the central square, on the exact spot where Lily had died. It was a simple stone pillar with her name carved into it. Beneath the name were the words. She reminded us what we were fighting for. Species from across the galaxy came to visit the memorial. Kovali warriors left weapons at its base as a sign of respect. Thieves and scholars read poems they had written in her honor. Even some Vectori came, those who had opposed their own government and paid the price for it. They stood before the stone and bowed their heads in shame for what their people had done. Thomas visited. Every year on the anniversary of her death, he would stand before the memorial for hours, not speaking, just remembering. He remembered her laugh. He remembered her endless questions. He remembered the way she used to climb into his lap and demand stories about blue skies and green forests. Elena often came with him, though not always. Her grief had never fully healed. Some wounds were too deep. As the years passed, the galaxy changed. Worlds that had been dead under Vectori rule began to bloom again. Species that had been enemies learned to work together. Children grew up in freedom, never knowing what it had been like to live in fear. Thomas grew old. His hair turned white. His body grew weak. But his eyes never lost the fire that had driven him through the war. On his last visit to the memorial, he was alone. Elena had passed away the year before, finally at peace. He placed his hand on the cold stone and spoke to his daughter for the last time. "We did it, sweetheart. We built the world you deserved. I'm sorry you never got to see it. But every child who grows up free, every family that stays together, every species that lives without fear, they all owe something to you." He smiled, and for a moment, he looked like the young father who had once told bedtime stories about a beautiful planet called Earth. "I'll see you soon. Lily, wait for me." Thomas Marin died 3 days later in his sleep. With a photograph of his daughter in his hands, the galaxy mourned him. They called him the father of freedom, the breaker of chains, the man who had turned grief into liberation. Statues were built in his honor. Ships were named after him. But the greatest monument to his legacy was not made of stone or steel. It was the galaxy itself. A galaxy where species that had once been slaves now govern themselves. A galaxy where children played under open skies without fear. A galaxy where the strong did not crush the weak, but lifted them up. The Vectori had ruled through fear for 3,000 years. They fell in 18 months, and the lesson they taught the universe in their fall was simple. Fear can control people for a while, but love, hope, and the will to be free will always win in the end. Always.